So the long-awaited Resident Evil 4 remake has finally been released, and it follows on a string of remakes beginning with the release of the Resident Evil 2 remake in 2019. It has already sold 3 million copies worldwide, which is kind of interesting considering that at the time of the release of the original game, the franchise was actually on a bit of a decline, with RE3 and Code Veronica never quite managing to top Resident Evil 2. And with all of the Raccoon City events neatly wrapped up, the game took a vastly new direction, making the game more linear and action-focused with an over-the-shoulder view that revolutionized games. And for a while it became the de facto way to play games, with the most notable example being Gears of War, and later on Dead Space, that literally would not even exist in its current form without Resident Evil 4. Like, the impact that the game has had on gaming is hard to even put into words, and since its release it has joined the pantheon of video games considered the greatest of all time. So it's not surprising that Capcom was initially afraid of remaking RE4 since it was such an iconic and defining game, but with RE2 remake director Yasuhiro Ampo returning, there was never really any doubt that this game wouldn't be good. Like, seriously, this guy might just be Capcom's new rising star director, and the RE4 remake might just be the icing on the cake.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Okay, so first of all, yes, most of the iconic moments from the original are still in there. The bingo line is in, Leon can still suplex enemies, Luis is still charismatic and cool, the game is still wacky and over the top. The merchant still doesn't sell any of the ammo shown on the table, and the locals are still taking their time to perfect the meat. Now, for all intents and purposes, this game is a direct sequel to the Resident Evil 2 remake. We follow Resident Evil 2 protagonist Leon S. Kennedy, who has gone from a rookie RPD cop into a fully trained government agent, sent on a mission to retrieve the president's daughter who has been kidnapped by a cult near a Spanish village. Now, the first thing that you'll notice, of course, is that the game follows on with previous Resident Evil releases by trying to keep a more realistic tone. Leon feels a bit more like a real character who is still haunted by his experiences in Raccoon City and subsequent brutal training after he was sort of coerced into becoming a special agent. And you can tell, since the jokes he tells this time around, they feel more like someone trying to cope with a bad situation.
The chief gave the orders himself. Help him, he said.
I'm sure you boys didn't come all the way out here to roast marshmallows. Maybe you did.
Whereas in the original, he felt more like a cool badass rolling into town to save the day.
All by yourself?
I'm sure you boys didn't just tag along so we could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire. But then again, maybe you did.
Returning as well is everyone's favorite charmer, Luis Serra, who has a much bigger and expanded role this time around that really adds to his character. Like, he's got a greater sense of mystery, and they really capitalized on the wasted opportunity they had with him in the original. And of course, Ashley is also returning, and here the developers apparently took in a lot of feedback regarding her, and it shows, as she never really gets in the way during the moment-to-moment gameplay, and even though she does get down a few times, I mean, she doesn't constantly scream for Leon's help like in the original. She's also written more like a real person this time around, and she really goes from kind of a regular person thrown into a real nightmare, and by the end of their horror-filled run, she does feel like she's had some actual character development, which is kind of rare for a horror game. There's also tons of little quips and jokes between her and Leon, and their interactions are pretty spot on.
You do a lot of missions like this?
Well, yeah, but I'm not used to having such good company.
Is that a compliment?
Take it however you want.
Now, there are a couple of things changed here and there as well. Like in the original game, the villagers at one point hack into Leon's radio, resulting in Leon and Salazar taking turns throwing stupid one-liners at each other.
I let our miserable insects out for some exercise down in the sewer.
Thanks. That should keep me company, 'cause boredom kills me.
But all in all, the changes are for the better and manages to keep a consistent tone for the game that makes more sense coming from the more grounded Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. So regarding the combat and gameplay, like this game, just like the original, basically never stops being entertaining, but it's also not like a carbon copy of the original and comes with a lot of interesting new updates. Like, one of the things that surprised me in this game was when I got attacked by a pitchfork by one of the villagers, and it's like things like that just speaks to how much more frantic and in your face the gameplay is in this one compared to the original. And honestly, I feel like like this post right here perfectly sums up just how fluid the dodge and parry mechanics are in this game, with the whole thing flowing in a really captivating way. Like the moment-to-moment gameplay might be the best experience I've had since playing Sekiro for the first time. Now interestingly enough, this game doesn't have quick time events like the original, so this dodge and parry system was actually designed purely with the Krauser fight in mind. And although the knife parrying mechanics can be a bit too easy, as with few enemies on the screen you can basically just spam the parry button and it'll counter every attack, but with a lot of enemies on screen you're still going to need to move around a lot in order to avoid getting hit. Now there are also options for stealth and sneak killing, but at least on the lower difficulties it's more of an optional thing, which is nice since the franchise was never really known for its stealth gameplay to begin with anyway. And everything is of course way more modernized and the game has been updated to a standard that gamers expect from a modern game. Like the original game pretty much introduced us to the concept of being afraid of shooting enemies in the head, as they would get way more horrifying if you did. And all of that is back, as well as being able to shoot axes thrown at you mid-air, or making dynamite explode before enemies even have a chance to throw them. And your knives also have like durability, meaning they can break, which means you have to choose whether you want to sneak kill enemies or have a knife ready whenever you get grabbed by someone. There's also a really new and interesting change to the enemies, like regular ganados coming back to life if you don't put them down with your knife, and they will be faster and more hectic than before. So you really have to choose whether you want to use up knife durability to put them down once they start twitching, or continue wasting ammo on them once they've been resurrected. And there's also this big hammer swinging cowhead guy that shows up every now and again. And without spoiling things, later on in the game there's even more tweaks to returning enemies that will keep fans of the original on edge. The merchant is also back this time around, selling weapons and upgrades. There's also the occasional sale where you buy one item and get one for free. You can also do side quests where you can use the spinel to buy gems in order to combine them with other treasures to sell at a higher value, or buy additional parts for your weapons or resources needed to craft ammo. There's also a new shooting range which allows you to get charms giving you buffs that will help you along your way. Now I've seen some complaints about a lot of the side quests basically just amounting to shooting hidden things found across the levels, and that they don't really add anything to the game. However, I feel like people are missing the point in that the side quests aren't the point of the game, they're just something extra for you to do while enjoying the main experience. Now weapons feel great in general, and with upgrades almost all of them are useful, and there's not really any weapon that you just can't use in order to beat the game, and upgrading them becomes more crucial towards the end of the game, especially reload speed, as the animations can be pretty long and there are some certain hectic enemies that will mess you up pretty badly if you're caught needing to reload. Like honestly, this game feels sort of like the game that the Resident Evil 3 remake wanted to be, which is ironic considering that M2 was going to make RE4 as well. But after RE3 failed to live up to expectations, Capcom went in and took over the production of this game, and I guess we're all better off for it, because this game feels like the culmination of all the 3 remakes that came before it. Now a direct comparison between this and the original game would be rather pointless, since it's 28 years since it was released.
I'm too old for this shit.
But needless to say, the game looks better, like a lot better. Like all modern Resident Evil games, Resident Evil 4 runs on the RE engine, and just like Unreal and Unity, it has a certain look and feel to it. It was originally designed for Resident Evil 7 and uses a technique called photogrammetry, which is what gives the game such a realistic tone. And I honestly think that when we look back on this era, the RE engine is most likely going to go down in history as one of the best looking engines of this generation. Like basically the game does the thing that Diablo 2 did, where it feels like the graphics used to look like this.
Nice.
And overall the environments look fantastic. It doesn't matter if you're inside a castle or running outside in the village countryside, the game's visuals are always on point. And like all modern titles, at least on PC, the game runs extremely well. Now one thing I never really liked about Resident Evil 5, even though it controlled and played a lot like Resident Evil 4, was its atmosphere and tone. It felt too much like an action game and lost all feelings of dread and suspense. And although the same guy directed all 3 games, the atmosphere here is absolutely perfect. It always manages to keep a consistently scary and foreboding atmosphere. Like horror games are usually ranked on a scale of like a fun time at the local amusement park's house of horrors to existential dread-inducing I have to drop the controller right now. And Resident Evil 4 has always just sat to the mid-right on this scale, and that's not a bad thing. Not every horror game needs to be the scariest ever to be considered great. And with Yasuhiro Ampo at the directing seat, the tone is always on point. Like I really want to know what kind of special sauce he's pouring into that mix, you know? And if video game writing used to be at the level of 80s action movies,
here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
I'd say we're definitely approaching late 90s now, and it's all for the better. And although the game is less goofy and campy overall, all the characters are still faithful to the original, and what I really liked is that the game still manages to keep that same mysterious vibe I remembered the original having. And don't get me wrong, like while the game is definitely over the top, it still feels like, dare I say, grounded. It doesn't have the zany boulder punchy stuff of RE5. Like there's a scene where you defend Ashley while she's using a wrecking ball to tear down a wall, and while wacky, it feels like something that, you know, could happen. Like the game is as grounded as it can be for a Resident Evil game, and for someone who didn't like the anime style of RE0 and Code Veronica, everything about the world just feels more real, even though it isn't, you know? So the boss fights in general are actually pretty good, especially with the new movement, and considering a lot of Resident Evil games just end up with you fighting a huge blob of an enemy, even though the game wasn't designed for those kind of fights. In this game it all works really well. Like all the key boss fights from the original are here, and although the creature in the lake is pretty boring as you just shoot spears at it until it dies, it's still only like the only poor encounter in this game, and the Krauser fights are way better in this game. Like the first one being a knife parry skill test basically, and the second one being a game of cat and mouse while avoiding traps, and all in all there was no boss that really screams that it was out of place with the new combat system. Okay, so when it comes to the horror elements of this game, one of the most terrifying locations in the game is where you're playing as Ashley trying to find a key to get Leon out of a cage, while running through dark hallways filled with Las Plagas who have inhabited suits of armor, and it's one of the most tense moments in the entire game, and it also doesn't overstay its welcome, which is like rare for these kind of moments in games. And there are also tons of optional places that you can go. For example, once you get control of Leon again, you can go back to the night place and complete a side quest by killing a special bigger version of them, as well as picking up the assault rifle, but all of this is completely optional and you might miss it the first time around. And the second most terrifying encounter in the game is of course with the returning regenerators, where you need to run around upgrading a key card to gain access to new locations, while this thing is hot on your heels, and it's just overall a really fun horror experience. Now while the chapter structure is still there, the game is more interconnected now, allowing you to travel between areas previously visited, and all of this makes the world feel more real and grounded, which is a good thing. Now the puzzles in this game aren't exactly groundbreaking or very hard for that matter, but they weren't in the original either, and they sort of just serve to slow down the pace for a few seconds and give you room to breathe. Like they are all pretty obvious in how you solve them, and since the game is linear, it's pretty hard if not impossible to miss any key items needed to solve them as well. One thing that I really love about this game though is that there's so many skips that you can do where normally games wouldn't allow you to do them. Like there's a shit ton of enemies and bosses that you can skip by laying trip mines. For example, the twin chainsaw sisters can be insta-killed by planting mines before their cutscene, and on New Game Plus you can do things like shooting the bell, causing all the villagers to give up and move into the church, instead of you having to fight them all over again. Like the only thing I really miss from the original is the save theme though. Like the new one to me is just a bit too ambient for my taste. But in general though, like in order to dislike this game, I think you really need to nitpick or just be really against remakes in general, because I've seen way worse AAA games being released scoring as high or higher than this remake does. And regarding remakes in general, I feel like there are too many people claiming that certain games don't need a remake, but what they fail to understand is that it is extremely hard to understand exactly why a game was lauded as a masterpiece when you play it 10 or even 20 years later and the gameplay just doesn't hold up anymore. Like I dare you to play this remake and go back playing the original immediately afterwards and tell me that the aiming on PC isn't extremely Yankee or there being a lot of outdated mechanics. And for people complaining that this game is missing like that special sauce, the thing you have to remember is that it is hard to release a game that is so iconic and defining like the original RE4. Like it's hard to just put into words how incredibly new and fresh that game was. And obviously the remake isn't going to capture that same feel, but you can however tell that this game was made by people who love the original game for people who love the original game. And although horror games will eventually go out of style again as gamers get used to the scares of this generation and want something new and fresh, in the meantime though, I will definitely enjoy this game for years to come, which is all I really wanted from this remake anyway.